everybody. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 15, beginning at verse 21 today. So let's begin with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, give you thanks this day for your grace and mercy. Give you thanks for a wonderful, exciting day here at Concordia that looking forward to. Right now, we give you thanks for your word. Ask your Spirit to be with us, to open our hearts in spirit to your message. In Jesus' name. And all God's people said,
Amen.
Amen. All right. Get my timer started here. All right. Matthew chapter 15. Let me review where we're at. We are in, as you know, we are in a long section between discourses. Now, I can't remember, are we between the third and fourth? I think we're between the third and fourth. Yes. We're in a long section between the third and the fourth discourses. And this whole idea in this section of discourse is building Jesus as the Messiah. This ongoing question Matthew's been having is, do we recognize him? Do we recognize who Jesus really is? And we're going to continue with that theme in our today. But what I'm going to tell you is, I don't know if we'll get there next week. But we are headed toward a climax in the book of Matthew. It's coming in chapter 16. That's kind of a teaser. Coming in chapter 16 is a climax to this question that's going to be a turning point in the book of Matthew. So, with that kind of tease, we're going to jump in at verse 21. And Jesus went away from there and withdrew to the district of Tyre and Sidon. And behold, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and was crying, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon." But he did not answer her a word. And his disciples came and begged him, saying, "Send her away, for she is crying out after us." And he answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." And he answered, "It is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." She said, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat from crumbs that fall from their master's table." And Jesus answered her, "O woman, great is your faith. Be it done for you as you desire." And her daughter was healed instantly. All right, this is one of those difficult passages we need to stop and struggle with a little bit. This comes on the heels, if we back up a little bit in your Bibles, comes on the heels of chapter 15, verses 10 to 20, when the Pharisees and the Sadducees had sent people to Galilee about washing, Jesus' disciples washing hands. And that confrontation that took place, we saw last week, in that rejection by them, not realizing who Jesus is, that continual rejection that Jesus keeps getting from the experts, from the leaders. And so what happens is, on the heels of that rejection, Jesus, it says, withdrew the district of Tyre and Sidon. Now, when the Bible, especially the New Testament, starts telling you details, those are important. Now, the significance of that is the district of Tyre and Sidon is north of Galilee. This is where I wish I had a map to be able to show you. Thank you. Galilee is up by the Sea of Galilee, Baja, right? Tyre and Sidon is north of that. Tyre and Sidon is not Jewish territory. It is not it was never part of the Holy Land. That's where non-Jews lived. So you see this rejection by the Jewish leaders, and Jesus is now fleeing out of the Jewish area up into the area of non-Jews. Right? And so he's going outside the region, and it says, "Behold, a Canaanite." Now, if you're Old Testament scholars, that name's going to ring a bell. Canaanites are the people who were the first inhabitants of the land. The Canaanites were the ones who were the idol worshippers. Canaanites were some of the people who led the Israelites in the Old Testament astray. Canaanites are decisively non-Jews. What we have coming to Jesus is an outsider, a foreigner, one of those people, if you've been with me. Knowing how Jews looked at non-Jews, that looked down on them, they really didn't even give them a word to title, other than the fact they called them non-Jews. Right? So this is a real, to a Jewish mind, this is a real outsider. And she comes out and sees Jesus. And obviously, she's heard what Jesus has been doing. Obviously, heard what Jesus is all about at some point in time. And she comes out, and verse 22 is an interesting statement. It says, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David." All right, so we have this non-Jew coming out and says, "Have mercy on me," which is typical saying. Non-Jew would have said that. "Have mercy on me, O Lord." That's not using the divine name. That's not using Yahweh. It's using the Lord as a sign of respect. "Have mercy on me, O exalted one," might be a better way of saying. And then she uses a really interesting phrase. "Son of David." Right? Son of David, that is, good Old Testament scholars, you're all going, why did a Canaanite woman use a decisively Jewish title? All right? Which is a really good question. You can make a lot of that. I'm not going to read today with it. But she uses a decisively Jewish title for Jesus. A title she really doesn't have a right to use, actually. Jews would have called Jesus that if they're understanding who he is. But she's calling him Son of David, which is interesting. And it comes in, you know the story, won't talk about it a whole lot. She comes in, she says, crying to help her daughter, and Jesus ignores her. Right? We can make a lot of that. And when Jesus seemingly ignores. Right? And then he says, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." That's one of those hard sayings that Jesus says. When Jesus comes, his first ministry is to the Israelites, to the Jews. He wants to start with the Jews. Paul did the same thing. Salvation begins with the Jews. Jesus started with the Jews. It's not that he didn't want other people to be saved, but he started with the Jews, wants the Jews to understand. All right? And she comes and says, Lord, again, same word, Lord, help me. Okay, give her credit. She's being persistent. Right? And he answered, "It is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." All right, now if you stop the conversation here, this is a really hard saying. Because he's calling her a dog. All right, now, you got to understand, dogs are cute today. Everybody wants a puppy. Loves a puppy. Right? We had a black lab, Bella, and Bella was wonderful. She was so warm and loving, even when she was, her last days when she was so sick. She was so warm and loving, and even when she was so sick, she tried to get up and greet you when you come in the house, and she's just wonderful. And we just love puppies, and we love dogs. They didn't. All right, they didn't. Dogs were kind of nasty. Dogs really didn't have this nice, wonderful added status symbol that they have today. Dogs were kind of the reject. Call somebody a dog is, it's kind of using a 4-letter word. All right, dog. I know dog is a 3-letter word, but we're going to make the jump. It's like calling somebody a 4-letter word. All right, it just is in Jesus' day. And throw it to the dogs. Now, you can make a lot of this and saying, okay, why didn't Jesus heal her daughter? Because that's what he does, right? Well, she's using this Jewish title, and she's not a Jew. And Jesus called her on it. He says, you're not a Jew, you're a dog. Right? And she says something of incredible faith. She says, verse 27, "Yes, Lord," same word, okay, respect. "Yes, Lord, even the yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. All right? In other words, it's simply this. I had a seminary professor who used to love to preach on this passage. And he would talk about it in this way. What she's doing is she's saying, yes, I'm a dog, but I'll take any scrap you got. Any scrap you got. Because I know any scrap from the master's table was priceless and priceless and so treasured. Take a twist here a little bit a second. She's sitting here saying, it says, yes, I know I'm a dog. I know I'm not a Jew. Kind of this subtle thing. Yeah, I shouldn't have called you son of David. I didn't have a right to do that. I'm a dog, but God, I'll take any scrap that you got. Because I know any scrap that comes from you is priceless and is more than enough. It's an incredible statement about grace, by the way. Any scrap that God gives us is overwhelming. Right? In just a few minutes, in a couple hours, well, probably a couple hours or so, hour and a half, we're going to be celebrating communion, right? What do you get? You get a little piece of bread and you get a little half a shot glass full of wine, right? And it's not much. It's a scrap. But what is it? It's the body and blood of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Even in the midst of the little things that come from God are filled with His grace and filled with His love and filled with His forgiveness. It's so valuable. And she realizes this. This is where Jesus is going in verse 28. If faith realizes that anything that comes from God is priceless, anything that comes from God is more than enough. You know, we say, give us faith, give us more faith. We don't need more faith. We need to use the faith we got. Because any gift, anything that comes from God is more than enough. Right? That's one of the things that this passage is running with. Right? She realizes that anything coming from God is going to be more than enough. But there's another story running in this passage. And it goes clear back to chapter 8, verse 10. Chapter 8, verse 10, Jesus is in Capernaum, and a centurion comes to him. A centurion comes to him asking for healing for one of his members of his household, and Jesus heals. We find in the Gospel of Matthew this consistent pattern. Those who are the outsiders, those who are the non-Jews, in this case a Roman centurion, in this case a Canaanite woman, people who are outside the family of Israel, they are beginning to catch who Jesus is and what He can do. They may not have all the Messiah thing figured out. They know who He is. They know He's from God. They know God sent Him. They know God works through Him and can do these things. It's these outsiders consistently down through the Gospel of Matthew. When Jesus encounters the outsiders, they figure out and know who He is. When Jesus is encountering the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the leaders of the people and the people in Jerusalem, they got no clue. And maybe I'll say it differently. Either they have no clue or they don't want to recognize it. They don't want to recognize it. It's this contrast. We've been going through this whole book. Is it, do you recognize Jesus yet? And the irony of this story is the people who shouldn't recognize Him are recognizing Him, and the people who should recognize Him aren't. Welcome to the Gospel. Welcome to the Gospel of Matthew. This twist that takes place, all right? It's going in. Now, this is a fun passage. This may come up this summer. We'll see if we're going to preach on this summer. Okay? Matthew readings come up in our scripture readings this summer. So, all right. Here we go. Got it? Cool. All right. Verse 29. Jesus went on from there and walked beside the Sea of Galilee. And he went up on the mountain and sat down there. And great crowds came to him, bringing with them the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others. And they put them at his feet, and he healed them. So the crowd wondered when they saw the mute speaking, the crippled healthy, the lame walking, the blind seeing, and they glorified the God of Israel. All right, so a little geography. Jesus, he's not telling us the travels, but Jesus was up the entire side north. He travels back down toward Capernaum and on the Sea of Galilee. Once up on the mountain, there's mountains all kind of around the area. You didn't have to, it's not like you had to travel miles and miles to find the mountain to walk up there. All right, walks up and sits down. And great crowds came to him, lame, blind, crippled, mute, and many others. Echoes of Isaiah chapter 35. We've talked about it extensively, where Isaiah 35 talks about how the Messiah who is to come is going to heal the blind, heal the lame, heal the crippled, heal the mute. Okay? And he heals them. This is another reference to Isaiah chapter 35. It's another reference to, back to this, our story. Do you get this yet? All right? Are you understanding this yet? Okay, this is not the first time. This is not even the second time Matthew's done this to us. We're referring us back here again. Okay. And he sits there and he says, going in, and the crowd wondered. The crowd wondered. Now, Galilee is predominantly a Jewish area, so there's probably this crowd was probably safe to say this crowd had Jews in it. There probably could have been some non-Jews in this area. But the contrast I want you to pick up on is in the midst of Isaiah 35, in the midst of having seen this before, and this is not the first time Jesus has done miracles down in Capernaum, Galilee area. Going in, these Jews are wondering. Remember, there's a difference between wondering and what the Canaanite woman just did, what we just saw. With the Canaanite woman, there's a recognition that this man's from God. And I'll take anything that God can give me. But in this passage, these Jews, who should know better, are wondering, going, Wondering is not recognition. Wondering is not faith. Wondering is nothing. Wondering is nothing. Okay? So it's back to Matthew's running this section saying, do you get this yet? All right? Do you get this yet? All right? So we're going to jump on. Okay? Verse 32. And Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion on the crowd because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. Oh, right? Did I get that? Did I start that right? Did I get that? Did I start that right? Yeah. Let's back up. Okay. Okay. This passage flows right from the previous section. Okay, flowing right out of verses 29 and through 31. Some commentators will put the two. Some editors will put the two together. ESV doesn't. So it's flowing right out of the previous section. So then Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion on the crowd because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And I am unwilling to send them away hungry lest they faint on the way. And the disciples said to him, where are we to get enough bread in such a desolate place to feed so great a crowd? And Jesus said to them, how many loaves do you have? They said 7 and a few small fish. And directing the crowd to sit down on the ground, he took the 7 loaves and the fish, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied. They took up the 7 basketfuls full of the broken pieces left over. Those who ate were 4,000 men, besides women and children. And after sending the crowds away, he got into the boat and went to the region of Magadan. All right, first question people always say, did we just have this? Well, we just had this. We had the feeding of the 5,000. Okay? Some writers, some commentators will say, well, what Matthew's done is just simply repeated the story. All right? most scholarship will say, conservative scholarship will say, no, this is a separate story. There was a feeding of the 5,000, now there's a feeding of the 4,000. Jesus does it twice to make sure you're getting the point. All right? Jesus is a good teacher, and good teachers repeat themselves. Jesus was a good teacher, and good teachers repeat themselves. Jim got it. Perry didn't catch it. Right? So he comes, and this is a very similar miracle to the last one, and don't have to go into it extensively like we did the feeding of the 4,000. You look back at our notes in the commentator when we did in chapter 14, verse 13, is where the feeding of the 5,000 is. Very, very similar. They're out in the wilderness. They have 7 small loaves of bread and a few small fish, and Jesus basically takes nothing out of the wilderness and provides bread in the wilderness for the multitudes. Right? Echo of the Exodus, as I call this. This is one of the Exodus miracles. Again, right? Jesus is doing one of these Exodus miracles for these Jews that had gathered around. Okay, and gather around and doing another one of these Exodus miracles. It's back to the same question: are you getting who Jesus is yet? Disciples are struggling. Last section, the people are wondering. The Pharisees and the Sadducees are rejecting him. The Canaanite woman did. All right. As we're building, as I said before, we're building. Matthew is a good writer and a good storyteller, and he's building us toward his story, is the climax of his story. Right. So, like I said, I could talk about this again, but a lot of stuff what I talking about this one is repeating what we did in the feeding of the 5,000. So I'll refer you back to a couple of weeks ago when we did the feeding of the 5,000. You want to hear that? That should be stuck out on Facebook and YouTube. It's going as well. Okay. Yeah, we're gonna rocking along today. All right, verse 16. And the Pharisees and Sadducees came, and to test him, they asked him to show them a sign from heaven. And he answered them, when it is evening, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. In the morning, it will be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah. So he left them and departed. All right. We have the Pharisees and the Sadducees back together again. I'll say what I said earlier. Many of you remember it by now because you quoted it back to me. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. That's the attitude of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And Matthew is more upright this time. Last time we saw this, they had a question, right? They just had a question about washing hands. This one is more blunt. They came to test. All right? They came to test last time, but they came to test this time. Okay? They wanted to prove his identity. All right? They wanted to prove his identity. All right? And he sits there and it says, test him, asking them to show a sign from heaven. Now, us Old Testament scholars, New Testament scholars, and our Lutheran theologians here, so there's a part of me that wants to scream at these Pharisees and Sadducees, saying, are you blind? Are you deaf? What do you think he's been doing for the last 3 years? Seriously, what do you think he was doing in the last story? What do you think he was doing in the story before that? The Isaiah chapter 35 story. Are you not getting this? Because this is like the plain as a nose on your face, and you're not getting this. So there's all kinds of stuff running around here. You can make this case, all right? They're not seeing, not getting it. You also make the point saying they are seeing it. They're seeing exactly who he is. They just can't accept the fact. They just can't accept the fact that he's Yahweh. Right? It doesn't really matter in this story because the bottom line of the story is that they're rejecting him. They're rejecting Jesus, is what they're doing. They want to test him. They want to trap him. All right? And we're going to see this coming up as we get close past our climax, which we're going to hit next week now. Past our climax and start moving from there onto the cross, we're going to start seeing more and more of this coming to trap with Jesus, get him in some sort of bind with everybody, and Jesus not having anything of it, okay, going in. And so, here, where do I want to go with this? All right, verse 3. Where Jesus talks, so he's stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the occurrence of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. Literally, what he's talking about is he's going back here to chapter 13. Remember when he talked about the purpose of parables? That he speaks in parables, so that those people who know will grow, and those people who don't know are blind, won't catch it. That's the purpose of the parables. Those people who understand will understand and grow, and those people who don't understand won't repent. God's sovereign choice. We've been through that one as well. Right? What he's saying here is, you guys are blind. Same thing he was doing with the parables. Is you guys are blind. You're not seeing it. You're not seeing it. You're not interpreting, seeing the simple things to be able to see it. It's one of those signs that they're spiritually blind to what's happening around them. Okay? What's taking place. Verse 4, and he says, an evil and adulterous generation. If they weren't ticked yet, they are now. Make sure you're catching what Jesus is doing. He says, an evil, adulterous generation. The unwritten words in this is like, comma, that means you. All right. An evil, adulterous generation, parentheses, italics, that means you. Going in. He's calling them out. He's calling them out. Right? And he's going back to the sign. We heard this back in chapter 12. Matthew's repeating himself. Sign to accept Jonah. All right. Which gets us back to this whole thing about recognizing Jesus, right? Recognizing who he is. We don't truly recognize who Jesus is until Easter morning, until the resurrection. You might have glimpses of it, you might see things, you might understand what's going on leading up to that, but you don't really grasp the full import and the full meaning of who Jesus is and what that means for the world until after the resurrection. Right? That's what's called, a lot of writers, we've talked about this before, it's called the Messianic secret. Is you can't understand Jesus, who he truly is, until Good Friday and the resurrection. I will take the two of them together. Good Friday and the resurrection. You don't understand who Jesus is until that point. And yes, we're building up to next week in chapter 16. But the real building in Matthew is chapter 27 and 28. 27 is the crucifixion, 28 is the resurrection. The chapters 27 and 28. That's the climax of this story, where we begin to see. Now, since we're in Pentecost, today's the day of Pentecost, we've got two things running, right? The disciples and the people going in here can't figure this out. And we're sitting here going, why can't they figure this out? Well, they haven't been blessed like we have. We live on this side of Pentecost, where the Holy Spirit has opened up through His Word, has opened up to what this means. We have teachers like Luther, we have teachers like Walther, we have teachers like our pastors that we've had, seminary professors. We've got a whole bunch of really, really smart people who grasp these things and have explained it to us. Yeah, we catch it and we're going, duh, why can't they get this? We understand it because we've got all this blessing. We've got this blessing that God has given to us through His Word and through time. Right? It's this idea is that we have been blessed. Okay, what's taking place, right? And so we're in the know because of the gift of the Holy Spirit. The story's building. Okay, the story's building for them. I'm going to cover one more. I'm watching my time this morning. We're going to cover one more. I can catch this. That'll set us up for next week. All right. Verse 5. When the disciples reached the other side, they had forgotten to bring any bread. Jesus said to them, watch and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And they began discussing it among themselves, saying, we brought no bread. But Jesus, aware of this, said, oh, you have little faith. Why are you discussing among yourselves the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive? Do you not remember the 5 loaves for 5,000, and how many baskets were gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000, and how many baskets you gathered? How is it that you fail to understand that I did not speak about bread? Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Then they understood that He did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. All right. This is a good story about Jesus clarifying what's happening in confusion with His disciples. All right, what's happening is that they were in Capernaum. Our last story took place in Capernaum. They are now headed across the Sea of Galilee because they're headed to Caesarea Philippi. They're headed up towards Caesarea Philippi. We'll talk about that next week. All right. So they're crossing the Sea of Galilee, and He says, be living with the Pharisees and Sadducees. They're immediately thinking physical bread, okay, because they're coming off the heels of the healing, or the feeding the 5,000. They're thinking literal bread, okay. They're not catching it yet, okay. And Jesus is correcting them, all right. Now, just kind of a note here in verse 6. Verse 6, what is taking place? Verse 6, they talk about the leaven. Verse 13, leaven is used in a good sense. All right? Here, leaven is used in a bad sense. And Jesus clarifies that toward the end of this section. All right? Verse 9 is coming in, and Jesus is basically asking the disciples, do you get this yet? All right? This isn't, Jesus saying, guys, this isn't about bread. Okay? This isn't about bread. Right? This is about who's doing the giving. He's back to this. Are you getting who I am yet? All right? You're getting who I am yet. With these baskets and what happened in the wilderness. All right? Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Right? And they understood that you not tell them the word of bread, but teaching the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Okay? Back to the first section, it's that they're clueless. Pharisees and Sadducees are clueless. Okay? Now we can talk a little bit, and I'll kind of talk a little bit and fill in the blanks a little bit on this. What Jesus is doing. All right? We've seen the Pharisees and the Sadducees. We know enough by now is that the Pharisees and the Sadducees are always testing, always running down, always doubting, they're the antagonists to Jesus in this story. And this is going to build, and it's going to grow as we get closer, and we know that's coming. But these false teachings, right? These false teachings, he said, is well, a little of these false teachings will go a long way, right? It used to make bread at our house. I haven't made bread in a long time. I had a bread maker. I'd make bread. You put a whole bunch of flour in the bread maker, right? And you have just a little bit of yeast, right? To leaven it. Doesn't take, all good cooks know, right? It doesn't take a lot of yeast to leaven a large lump of flour, right? A little bit of bad teaching goes can make a lot of damage. That's why we get so important and so about keeping our doctrine and our teachings correct. Because a little bit of bad teaching can go a long way. A little bit of bad teaching can do a lot of damage. Was taking place. And we need to be aware of that as we're teaching. Not in a fanatical sense, not in an obsessive sense, but we just need to be aware of it, aware of the fact that we need to keep our teaching pure, our teaching correct, so we don't get these false teachings running in here, what's taking place. Because that's really what Jesus is running with, and Jesus is running the story is running people away. Okay, running. As I said, we are building up to the next section. I'm going to stop here because I don't want to do this. I want to take the time to cover this, and we'll cover it next week because it leads into several things. Kind of stop it exactly where we wanted to stop. Okay. It's as we said. Kind of summarize a little bit. Matthew's been building to this. Do you understand? Do you know who Jesus is? Do you recognize who Jesus is yet? And we see consistently in the story is the Pharisees and the Sadducees know. Right? They keep asking for signs. And Jesus is like, are you clueless here? All right, and to test, and all these things. The Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes, the lawyers, they're the antagonists in this story. They're not getting it. The outsiders, like the Canaanite woman, like the centurion, they're getting it. They're understanding who Jesus is. The lepers are getting it, who Jesus is. Right? The sick and the lame, they're getting who Jesus is. The outcasts are getting and understanding who he is. See how the leaders who are clueless, the outcasts who are understanding, and the disciples are struggling. Disciples are struggling to put it all together and to grasp. Because Jesus has big plans for them, as we know. To grasp what's taking place. And so Jesus has them in our story. Matthew is a great storyteller. And I'm going to leave it right here. I'm a little short today, but I'm going to leave it right here so we can set up next week. Be sure you're joining us next week. Next week is really the climax of the first half of the book of Matthew. And it answers this question, do you get who I am yet? All right, do you recognize who I am yet? There's an answer to this question that's coming next week. So, with that in mind, Barry, you got anything?
Well, I noticed that Jesus clarified that the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000 were two separate events.
Exactly. Yep.
You
Right.
took what I was going to say.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yes, and see, you guys caught on, is those people who say that this was one feeding really have to do gyrations on this passage. All right? Really have to do gyrations on this passage. So, like I said, no conservative scholars or theologians, anybody will say, yes, there was two. Okay, why couldn't he have done it twice? All right? So, yeah, anything else?
Oh, he got it.
All right. So, all right, guys, we got a few minutes. I will see you all at 10:30 for worship. Have a great morning. Have a blessing. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all. And all God's people said,
Amen.
Amen. See you a few.